I don't think I've ever done anything quite like this. There's 4 layers to this, all cut out of 1/4-inch material. I have some 12 by 12 1/4-inch plywood, Baltic birch plywood that I bought, and it would be perfect for this. And this is 1/4-inch Baltic birch plywood, and I'm using a number 3 Pegasus modified geometry blade. I used a spray adhesive to attach the pattern to the wood. If you're new to scroll sawing, you should check out my video on 9 methods to attach patterns to wood. I'll leave a link. Try the ones that appeal to you, and then you can decide which is the best to use for each project. The back panel is going to be painted blue to signify the sky, and it's solid except for the moon cutout. I made that using an 1 3/8" Forstner bit. Later, I'll take the panel to my paint booth to spray on the blue paint. I didn't record that step because there isn't much to see making one hole on the drill press. If you look closely at the piece I'm cutting here, you'll notice that I haven't made the top and right side cuts for the frame around each seam. That's because these are going to be stacked and glued together to form the final display. I attached each pattern on the left side and bottom to the plywood. After I've made all the interior cuts, I'll glue them together, and the last step will be to make the cuts on the top and the right side at the table saw. This will ensure they all fit together properly and the final size is exactly right. The details on the balloons have some sharp points, which can be challenging to cut to look good. I started at the pilot hole and cut to the sharpest element of the point. If I tried to make a turn there, the blade would likely end up rounding the point at least a little bit. So from the point, I back up the blade to the pilot hole in the curve I just created. Then I cut down the line on the other side until I reach the point. The waste piece may or may not fall out. If it comes out, you've created more maneuvering room. If not, use the curve to go back to the pilot hole to make the cuts to the point on the other end. You can use a slightly different method to cut the sort of triangular sections on the top of the left balloon. Get to the corner, then back up the blade slightly so it is no longer cutting. Then you can turn the workpiece until it is cutting in the next direction you wish to go. Start pushing the workpiece into the blade and cut until you reach the next corner, then repeat the whole process until that section is completely cut. The most difficult part of cutting the balloons is going to be the gondolas. You might want to slow the blade speed down a little bit, as the blade is less aggressive at lower speeds. Another tip for cutting in this area would be to make sure you don't go past the lines, or you could completely cut through the little supports attaching the gondola to the balloon. When I'm cutting areas like this, I try to stay inside the lines rather than cutting right on the lines as I usually do. This leaves you with a tiny bit of extra material in areas where it's needed to maintain the integrity of the pattern. There's your gondola on each balloon. Go back to the top now. Finish that. If you're good at painting, you could paint these balloons some nice bright colors. I'm not good at painting, so I'm not going to paint them. All right, that's it, except for the half a dozen, 6, 7 stripes on the other balloon. These 2 big cutouts. I'll do these last because once I make this cutout, this is gets a little bit on the thin side. A little bit on the thin side. You've taken a lot of strength away from that piece of plywood. So I'll do that. I'll show you a little bit on each panel, and then obviously the finished product. There's the layer with the balloons finished. The panel with the old vehicle doesn't have a lot of cuts, but some of them are really tiny. I thought these might require a smaller blade, so I checked my supply and found a Niqua, that's spelled Niqua, number 20 blade. The teeth are too small to see, and even my test of running the blade across my thumb to find out which way to mount the blade was difficult. I threaded the blade through the pilot hole in one of the windows, which was actually one of the larger spaces I needed to cut on the truck. I already had this speed dialed down, but I decided to lower it even more. As I did when cutting small spaces on the balloon, I tried to stay on the inside of the cut lines. I found it challenging to control the cut as well as I would have liked, and I chalked it up to a lack of experience with a blade this small. The scroll saw is not noted for its ability to follow a straight line accurately, and doing the straight lines on this vehicle was difficult. The vehicle had some extremely fine details, like the bumpers and even a radiator cap. I regret to say I was not able to get that to look right, so I just cut it off completely. I won't tell anyone if you don't. Finally completed the very fine details, then switched back to a familiar number 3 Pegasus modified geometry blade to make the large cut along the side of the frame. The last panel contained the house and the barn. After the cuts I had made for the balloons in the vehicle, this was refreshingly easy. There are a lot of 90-degree turns, but I've been doing this so long that they are routine for me. If you're new to the scroll saw, this should become easy for you too after a bit of practice. The layers are all cut and I'm ready for the glue up. I set them on top of each other in order to make sure I glue them in the proper sequence. Then I set all but the bottom layer aside. I'm using Tight Bond's white glue because it dries clear. I applied it with a small tip bottle because I wanted to make sure I glue on all those small spaces between the stripes on the balloons. This layer will make direct contact with the back, but the other layers are going to have minimal touching with each other. They will mostly be held together with the glued edge frame. Even though there are areas at the top and right side that were going to be trimmed off later, I spread glue on these spots as well. It was important that the frame areas were secure. Rather than trying to determine where they left off, I glued all the way to the edge. Scrap was not going to be useful anyway, so I wouldn't be wasting material unnecessarily. I used the bottom and left side of each layer as the place to match them for the glue up. The squares I started with all had 90-degree corners, and I oriented the patterns to the left and bottom on each layer. This way I knew all the seam layers would match as they should. With one corner accurate, I could match them all from there. I decided to use the vise on the end of my workbench to hold the bottom of the assembly. The vise applies lots of pressure to the bottom surface. I added some F-clamps to the sides and top. Normally, F-clamps have a tendency to move the pieces a little, but the bottom in the vise kept that from happening. With the glue dried, it's time for the final trim. I used the miter gauge to hold this assembly in place, made sure it was set to make the cut exactly where I wanted it, and then I put the blade guard back into place. I put on my hearing protection, made the cut, then waited for the blade to stop before removing the waste piece. This also required a rip cut, so I double-checked the measurement on the workpiece and then the fence setting. I put a featherboard in place to hold the piece tight against the fence, and I used a push stick to hold the piece flat against the table and to feed it through the blade. Once again, I waited for the blade to stop before removing the good and the waste pieces. The edges will require just a tad of touch-up sanding at the disc sander to remove the saw blade marks and a little bit of burning. I use a quarter sheet of 150 grit sandpaper by hand to soften the edges. The last step will be to give everything a protective spray polyurethane finish. As I mentioned at the beginning, I can't remember ever making a project like this before. Most of it was easy, with the exception being the vehicle on the front panel. It proved to be exceptionally challenging, with some tiny cuts and a number 20 blade. I would appreciate a like if you enjoyed the video, as it helps me to grow the channel. And if you're still in the mood to watch some more videos, a suggestion for one to watch next will be on the screen. I hope to see you there.